This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Zach Gorchow. After what felt like an endless election, we are making the pivot back to action within our state capital in Lansing, where the soon-to-end Democratic trifecta, as a result of Republicans winning control of the House, now must decide what, if anything, it will do with its remaining days in power. Speaking of power, joining us today is a powerhouse in the Capitol Press Corps, expert on luxury coffee makers, more on that in a minute, and perhaps the finest writer of Freedom of Information Act requests in our state, Detroit News reporter Beth LeBlanc. Beth, welcome back to MichMash.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for that intro. I'm not sure I've deserved it. I haven't received one like that before.
Well, we want to make sure the audience is awake and listening, so it's great to have you here. So we're now in what's called the lame duck session. It's an odd term. Can you explain what it is and why there's some expectation of a blitz of new laws passing the legislature?
Yeah, so the lame duck session is the session days between Election Day and the end of session, which is at the end of December. And we're expecting a rush of legislation because Democrats in the House, at least, are losing power come January 1st. And so any unchecked boxes that they have in terms of policy priorities are going to get pushed through, they hope, over the next few weeks. There are, of course, a few flies in the ointment in that sense, but we're expecting a really big rush. And you saw it, I think the most memorable for me was the 2018 lame duck, when Governor Snyder was leaving office and Governor Gretchen Whitmer was coming into office. And there were some late night sessions that year and a lot of legislation that got through. So I think people are kind of preparing for something similar, but it depends on if Democrats are able to find some consensus within their caucus.
You know, I think we all have flashbacks to that 2018 lame duck. I think, if I remember, there was something like 400 bills sent to the governor's desk in that last 6 weeks. And the governor signed something like 350 of them. It was unbelievable. But you sort of hinted at what I wanted to get at, which was the House, Democratic majority. It is like dysfunction junction over there right now. It feels like between attendance issues, internal disagreements, dismay among some faction of the caucus about what they've done and what they haven't done this year. The House did decide to grace Lansing with its presence this week, kind of. How did the week start off on Tuesday in the House?
It started out with a very long caucus meeting, which, of course, everything said in caucus stays in caucus until it doesn't. But from what we understand is that it was a pretty contentious caucus meeting. It was hours long. So for reporters, we kind of stay on the House floor, wait for them to come back. There was a long agenda to go through, and they ended up just getting two bills on, I guess, what estheticians are able to do within their licensure. So it wasn't headline making, to say the least. But yeah, so and one of the things I think that triggered that long caucus, and one of the difficulties that Democrats have dealt with throughout this session is attendance, right? They have a very slim majority. It's 56-54. If anyone is missing, they have to rely on Republican votes, which are hard to come by with Matt Hall leading that caucus. I also think not just attendance, but you also have people within the caucus who are opposed to some of the priorities that are coming up. In particular, any economic development policy issue where there is corporate incentives or tax breaks or tax credits for folks. You have a couple within the Democratic caucus who are going to draw the line there. And so you're going to need Republican votes for that as well. So if Tuesday was any indication of what's to come, it's going to be a difficult lame duck, I think, for Democrats to rally votes.
You know, people have asked me, like, boy, what do you think? Lame duck, is it going to be just a blitz of action? And, a year ago, if you had told me the Democrats were going to lose control, I would have said yes. But the way this year has played out, and then we saw, State Representative Karen Whitsett, a Detroit Democrat, was absent on Tuesday, said she wasn't feeling well. It was a surprise to House Democratic leadership. That is what, basically meant that 90% of what they had on their tentative agenda got shoved into Wednesday. And Wednesday saw more drama. One of the Democrats, Representative Rachel Hood of Grand Rapids, basically said she's had it with the House twiddling its thumbs all year and wants the Democratic majority to pass some landmark changes before it's too late. Or she's not going to come to session unless the speaker dispatches the state police to drag her in. You almost couldn't make this up. But that said, there was some honest to goodness action in the House yesterday. Maybe hit a couple highlights for us. Yeah,
so there were quite a few economic development bills that were able to get through. One was tax breaks for data centers, R&D tax credits, an innovation fund for startups. There was a lot that got through in terms of some economic development. It was kind of low-hanging fruit for economic development bills. The big ones, the reforms to the SOAR program or direct incentives for a pretty large semiconductor facility that appears to be about to announce for Mundy Township. So they were able to get to that economic development low-hanging fruit during that session, but it wasn't without some drama. I mean, like you said, Rep. Hood said beforehand that if there are attendance issues, then that really fouls up the work for what the legislature is able to do, and that she wouldn't come. And you even saw after they took that data center vote, which Rep. Hood was not in favor of, likely didn't want to vote on. She was reminded by House sergeants during that session that Rule 32 was in effect, which was that you have to remain seated during that time. So she had to be reminded. I mean, and I think, a lot of lawmakers get antsy during session and they have to be politely reminded. I think this was that she didn't want to stay in session after that vote took place. Zooming out a bit, what are the big issues you're tracking to see if Democrats can move before the end of the year? I mean, some of the big issues we're watching in particular is the amount of reform that they want to do to the SOAR program, which is the business incentive program that's been used for multiple companies to give them hundreds of millions of dollars in order to lure them to set up operations in Michigan. Largely, they've gone to EV plants so far, but the crown jewel that they've been trying to land is a semiconductor facility, which is development over multiple years, very high-paying jobs. And Michigan has really been working to land one really since like 2021, 2022. And they look poised to do so in Mundy Township. I don't think everything is signed on the dotted line just yet, but that is going to require, we believe, a pretty big incentive from the state. And so you're going to be battling within the Democratic caucus and then trying to attract some Republican votes to support those incentives and the overall reform of the SOAR program. Outside of that, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of legislation that's hanging out there still, some a little more progressive, polluter pay. There's a lot still hanging out there, and some, perhaps that haven't been introduced yet. Sometimes they surprise us with some last minute legislation that comes out of nowhere. One of the big ones too is people have been demanding for a long time changes to the paid sick leave and tipped wage credit, which of course the Michigan Supreme Court ordered be put into place in February, and it's caused a bit of a panic among businesses that are worried about what kind of impact those new laws will have on restaurants or on, relationships with their employees when it comes to paid sick leave and what they're able to do and how they're able to enforce like attendance at the company at the end of the day. So those are some of the big ones. And I don't see Republicans moving much until or unless those changes are made to paid sick leave and tipped wage. I think if there's one thing that Democrats could maybe rally the forces on, it would be the kinds of legislation that organized labor favors or that is sort of in the consumer realm. So like they've hauled out what would be a tremendous change in the state's Consumer Protection Act to restore a lot of provisions that were lost in a Supreme Court ruling that's 25 years ago. There's a
massive workers' compensation overhaul that's been introduced. We'll see if that moves. There was the chair of the Energy and Environment Committee in the Senate introduced a proposal to expand the state's bottle law, put that on the ballot. So all these things, like you said, that could just pop up kind of last second. All right, let's get to the coffee maker. Apparently, the ticket to a $4,500 Jura coffee maker is a large taxpayer grant, not much oversight, and a questionable idea of how to spend the public's money. Tell us about what you've reported this year.
Yeah, so this all kind of dates back to 2022 when Republicans were in power, and they put through kind of a big rush of what we like to call pet projects, earmarks. There are a lot of pork barrel spending, basically special projects where you would give direct grants where there isn't a competitive grant making process, and lawmakers basically ask for certain grants. Well, one of those that came through was a $20 million grant for a nonprofit like business incubator to attract businesses from outside of the United States. When we started looking into it, the nonprofit that was described in this budget language had not been formed when the budget was passed. So that was like the first tip we had that something was off, because it hadn't been incorporated with the state prior to getting $20 million. When we started looking into it further, the speaker was listed as the sponsor. He denied being the sponsor. When we looked into it even further later on, when it started actually getting money from the state, and we looked into the receipts that they had, one of the big expenditures that stood out to us was a $4,500 coffee maker that was purchased with this $20 million grant. There was also a first class ticket to Budapest that was $11,000. There were certain expenditures that kind of stood out. And so earlier this year, we did a story on it. The legislature was pretty upset about how this was being used. They blamed the MEDC. The MEDC is bound by the language that the legislature put in place and has to administer the grant based on that language. The legislature initially proposed language that would kind of claw back the grant and say, okay, let's stop giving money to this company. But that language was eventually also clawed back, and they never put that language ultimately in the budget that was passed. So the company, the woman who owns the company, she wrote a letter to the governor in May saying, okay, I'm going to shut down this company because obviously the headwinds are against us. We're getting negative media coverage. We're getting, the legislature saying they're going to claw back the grant. So we will agree to wind down this grant and close down the company. Well, fast forward 6 months, and they've spent almost $1 million since then, and they haven't wound down the company, and it does not appear that they intend to at this point. So we did a recent update, just letting people know. And I mean, you're correct that it is a story that I think some could predict, looking at the process that's used for those earmarks, right? They are put in the budget after midnight in most cases. Not a lot of people get to review them. You don't know who the sponsor is until months later. They're often going, in 2022 in particular, they were often going to folks who had contributed to lawmakers or were, operatives within the Democratic or Republican parties. There were a lot of different factors that appeared to have led to those grants at the end of the day.
So I want to read Beth's lead from the story of hers the News published this week, because it's really good and just eye-popping. So here we go. A Metro Detroit businesswoman told Governor Gretchen Whitmer's office 6 months ago that she would close down a controversial business venture funded by taxpayer dollars, but she has yet to do so and has spent another roughly $735,000 since. That is just wild. The state has handed out so many of these grants, and it just doesn't seem like there's very much oversight other than your FOIA requests. Can you talk a little bit about how you've used the Freedom of Information Act to dig into this?
Well, FOIA has been absolutely instrumental in understanding how this all works. So first off, and the hard part is that in order to FOIA something, you have to understand what kind of documents a company is putting in. And I'm telling you, the language surrounding these grants is very spare, and you can't really, it's very difficult to understand what kind of paperwork they're going to have to submit at the end of the day. But eventually we're able to sort through it to figure out what kind of paper trail this company would have. So, I mean, I think it started with, we asked the budget office for, they have to submit this paperwork showing who sponsored it and what they plan to do with the grant and who it's actually going to, because sometimes you can't even tell from the budget language who it's going to. So we were able to FOIA those records. I think we just put in like an informal request, and they gave us some of those records. And then later on, we figured out that these companies have to submit quarterly reports showing how they spent the money, and sometimes attaching receipts, sometimes not. It depends on the thoroughness of the company that received the grant, and that the MEDC basically just collects all this paperwork, but doesn't really review it until half of the grant is spent. So like in this case, they wouldn't have reviewed any of those financial statements from this company until $10 million had been spent. But we knew they were getting them. So we put in FOIAs asking for those quarterly reports. And we have to do it every quarter. We have to ask for them. And they're long and in-depth. And to this company's credit, I mean, I know there are a lot of concerns over the $4,500 coffee maker and the Budapest flight, but I think this company is correct that we wouldn't have these records if they weren't so thorough in their reports. So to their credit, I've reviewed other reports from other companies, and they list far less detail. And I don't want to give this company any ideas about listing far less detail. I mean, they're being investigated now, so I don't think they will. But a lot of these companies don't list a lot of detail. So even if the MEDC is checking after half of the grant is spent, what are they checking? Is basically what these companies say they spent it on, and they some of them do not provide much detail at all.
So I want to give a quick shout out here to Chris DeWitt, who's best known as the longtime spokesperson for former Attorney Generals Frank Kelly and Jennifer Granholm. He now operates a company called FOIA Services Michigan, and that tracks all incoming Freedom of Information Act requests to state of Michigan agencies. We at Gongwer subscribe to his service, which means we get a weekly report from Chris of all new FOIA requests. And Beth, you are a prolific requester of public records in Michigan, and the entire state honestly owes you a debt of gratitude for what you've been doing. But can you describe your approach to using the law in general? It can be so frustrating, but you've been able to make it work. Your stories are testament to that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is trial and error, to tell you the truth. I mean, sometimes we put in FOIAs and we get nothing back. So then you have to adjust it. Sometimes you can work with folks at the agency to figure out the best way to phrase it. And then other times, I mean, sometimes it's just because I'm a nag. I mean, like, if they're really late with a FOIA, or if they are charging us an ungodly amount, I'll call them up and I'll say, like, hey, that's not right. And we will, and we do this in stories a lot. Like, if there is a really long delay, if there is an ungodly amount of redactions, if there is a really high bill for it, we will publish in the story all of those details so that people have a full understanding of all the hurdles that their public officials put in front of us in order to get records about how their taxpayer dollars are being spent. And I feel like that is something where, like, you know, we don't advocate as reporters, but that is something where I feel like we can, right? Because we need it to do our job. And I think it's an uncontroversial thing to say that, in fact, it's in the law that we should have access to these records, especially when they are financial. I mean, it's not even through FOIA that we have access to financial statements. That's in the state constitution.
Absolutely.
So I think in the past, I know the MEDC has tried to redact some financial information from different records we've received, and we've appealed it, saying you don't have the right to do this. Not even under the law, under the Constitution, you don't have the right. You have to show records of how financial of how taxpayer money is being spent. So I do think it's a lot of nagging. It's a lot of trial and error. It's a process, and it's annoying. It really is. I mean, I'm sure for them too, who are getting my calls and my FOIAs, but for us too, there are so many hurdles that are thrown in your way, and there are so many loopholes in the law that are exploited just on a regular basis, and those loopholes have not been closed at all.
So, Beth, let's close with a bit of a preview we got this week on 2026 politics. I can't believe we're already talking about it, but it's also, I can believe it. So Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan is not running for a fourth term, and the speculation has long been that he is eyeing a run for governor. This week, he said he wasn't going to have anything to say about his future for either a couple of weeks or a couple of months, depending on when he was saying that. But how might he fare in a Democratic primary for governor should he go for it?
I mean, it's hard to say without knowing who all the players would be within that Democratic primary. And if there are a lot of players, you know, we've seen in Detroit primaries in particular that when you get a lot of people in those primaries, it splits so many ways that it's almost like luck of the draw if you got the majority. But I think Duggan has built a name for himself within Detroit, I think a lot of the state has looked at what he's done in Detroit, and they've paid close attention to what he's been doing there. So I think he has a good chance to get through the primary. But again, that has a lot to do with who else is in the primary at that point.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we don't have a lot of honest to goodness, like multi-candidate heavyweight Democratic primaries for governor. They tend to sort this out kind of behind the scenes. But there's a lot of Democrats will talk about how we have a deep bench, and that is true. But that can mean when the big prize is open, the governorship, that everybody gets into it, and it can be a heck of a mess. So, we'll see what Secretary of State Benson, I think people expect, is going to run. Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist, I think people expect, is going to run. And there could be a whole raft of others. There's the Pete Buttigieg factor. That would be really interesting. And, probably half the members of the legislature are thinking about it. So it's going to be really interesting to watch. All right. I have to close with this question. Are you saving for a Jura coffee maker for yourself now, or are you more of a Keurig or just classic coffee maker person?
I have to say, after the first story ran, I was like, Beth, you should get a better coffee maker. So I went to Meijer and I got a Mr. Coffee Maker, which probably says a lot about what my old coffee maker was like. So no, I'm not really a coffee snob. I am a Tim Hortons fan.
Nice.
And I would advocate, if somebody wants to start a business in downtown Lansing, I would be a frequent customer if anybody could start a franchise down in downtown Lansing. But I don't really have highbrow tastes in coffee. So.
Well, I was sweating when I bought a Keurig for the office, and then I realized our previous coffee maker, I think, dated to the first term of the Clinton administration, so I didn't feel too bad about shelling out for that. But Beth, keep up the great work at the news, and thanks for joining us on MichMash.
Hey, thanks for having me.